Hi, today I'm going to talk about solitary confinement on prisoners with physical disabilities because from research, it's been shown that people with physical disabilities are even more vulnerable to solitary confinement and the effects um, of it. So, what is solitary confinement? As shown in the picture here, it is when you are held in a room like that, in the size of a parking space, for 23 to 24 hours. And you can see that there's only a bed and a toilet and maybe a small window and a small desk, but there's no book or you just stay there. And one prisoner says, "My cell is so small that I can only make 4 step tours until I touch the floor. Each time that I sit up off the bed, I have to watch how I stand up because I'll hit my hip on the table. It's just that close. As far as moving about, there's no movement. I have to wait until I go to the yard 3 times a week in order to stretch my legs out, oil up the joint in my knees. I have arthritis, and that has come from me being in the cell." So it's just so small that they can't even move. And if you're, for example, in a wheelchair, it'll be impossible for you to move at all. Um, so it's a really horrible condition. So as an introduction, approximately 80,000 to 100,000 people are held in solitary confinement in the U.S. And the average time that they spend there is 37 days or sometimes over years. And according to the UN, solitary confinement for over 15 days is considered torture. So the UN said that, but a lot of prisons still practices solitary confinement for um, over 15 days. And there's no clear data on how many prisoners have disabilities, and information is also limited on type of disability, but the estimate is that there's 32 to 40% of people who are in prison have some sort of disabilities. And there's also limited data on complaints filed by prisoners with disabilities. So maybe they might file a complaint, but it's not really handled by anyone, and so that increased the risk of harm, and there's less public monitoring. But from the data we have, it still shows that these people with disabilities are more vulnerable. The health effect of solitary confinement has been shown physiological and also psychological. Physiological effects are hypertension, trouble eating and digesting. So sometimes people have diarrhea and weight loss and loss of appetite and muscle pain in the neck and the back. So just like the prisoner before was complaining, you might develop arthritis. And you have also sleeping difficulties because you're more hypersensitive and it becomes difficult for you to sleep. And psychological and cognitive effects are panics and rage, so you have poor impulse control, and anxiety, which can lead to panic attacks, and depression, which can lead to suicide. So 50% of suicide that's committed in prison are inside solitary confinement. And aggression is also shown, which is interesting because people go into solitary confinement because maybe they're aggressive, but they come out even more aggressive. And memory loss, impaired concentration, and psychosis. So you might show sign of illusion and hallucinations. So these are all the health effects, which shows that solitary confinement is really not beneficial for you or good for you at all health wise. So the reasons for going to solitary confinement sometimes kind of makes sense, just from reading what they reading here. So they might show risk. The prisoner might show risk to the safety and security of the correction institution, or violate the rule, or identify as vulnerable and separated from the general population. But this is judged by the correctional officer, not a judge. So it becomes very subjective. So sometimes the real reasons that these prisoners go to solitary confinement is because of gang violation based on tattoos or reading materials, failures to obey on order promptly, possession of $5 or more without authorization, refusing to return a food tray, testing positive for marijuana, self-mutilation or attempted suicide for purpose of manipulation, and possession of excessive quantity of postage stamps. So I just read to you the effects of solitary confinement on your health, and these are the reasons really that they're going and to solitary confinement. And reasons for solitary confinement for people with disability has really nothing to do with safety. Even more, it might be due to because they have no accessible housing units for wheelchair. So since they don't have any place to put them, they just put them in a housing unit, or they're punished for rule violation caused by disability. So they maybe didn't obey the order that the correction officer was giving because they couldn't hear, and then they were put in solitary confinement. Or in this quote, it says MCIJ has an interpreter out on site Monday through Friday, but when we have appointments, example medical, there's no interpreter, and they say, oh, sorry, we forgot. So we schedule for a second appointment 3 weeks later, and the interpreter is there. Often officers and staff try to use their inmates to interpret for deaf inmates. So these people might have filed a complaint, and then that might be counted for a rule violation as well. So why do we care about physically disabled prisoners? In short, because we haven't put enough attention on them. So there is a movement to end solitary confinement in recent years, which had tremendous success. So legislative campaigns and litigation at state and local levels have been successful in ending indefinite placement in solitary confinement. And those laws limit the use of solitary confinement in vulnerable groups such as youth, pregnant women, persons with mental disabilities. But considerably less attention has been paid for most vulnerable group, people with physical disabilities. So we haven't really paid attention to people with physical disabilities. And under Americans with Disabilities Act, individual with physical or mental impairment that substantially limit one or more major life activities are protected from discrimination offered by reasonable alternative to navigate their physical spaces. And these physical spaces is also prison. And if you have physical disability, you really cannot navigate in a solitary confinement. So why people with physical disabilities are more vulnerable? It's because they're denied self-care and they have heightened sense of isolation compared to non-disabled people. So denied self-care. They're denied medication sometimes. They're denied for urination and shower. And the architectural barriers shown in here makes it really hard for you to move around, which is magnified in solitary confinement because it's such a small space. And they're unable to maneuver inside the cell with a wheelchair, unable to use the toilet, forced to sit in his own feces and urine, and the officers are refusing to clean them. And maybe there are no bars to take the shower, and they also feel the heightened sense of isolation because, for example, deaf prisoners cannot yell to communicate. They really don't have anyone to communicate with, even during those break hours. Why do we need to act now? It's because disabilities are common in jail. 32% of people, of prisoners, have disabilities, and we have to listen to their needs according to the ADA. And they are heightened vulnerabilities. They're subject to ridicule and harassment. And people with disabilities are 3 times more likely than non-disabled people to experience violent crimes such as stabbing, sexual assault, robbery, and theft. And also it is not fair that in order to protect them, we put them in solitary confinement just because we don't really have a space that's safe for them to be in. So we should really act now. And just to show you that people with solitary confinement in solitary confinement are people, and they had a home and they had hopes. So this is a super max prisoners in solitary, which were giving one photo request, and this is a photo of his aunt's house. So we should listen to them because they are people too. And these are the references. Thank you.